this evening. Her presentation is entitled "The Genetics of Vice." So let's welcome Paige. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am not that chagrined to be mistaken for a professor of philosophy. I have a great respect for philosophers, and but I am a psychologist. I'm at the University of Texas. I was originally hoping to be there with you today in person, which would have been much better, and I would have really enjoyed to meet everyone. So I'm disappointed I couldn't be there, and thank you for tolerating a Zoom talk instead of an in-person talk. I'm wondering before I get started if it would be possible for y'all to switch the camera back so that I could see a little bit of the audience rather than the lectern. I don't know if that's possible. While that's happening, what I want to do today to begin is ask you to think about an unusual place at a relatively unusual time. So I want you to imagine a decadent imperial power riven by internal tension, beset by external enemies, where Christianity has been embraced, at least in name, at the highest levels of political power. And also, it is an imperial power that is only decades away from collapse. What I'm talking about, of course, is Rome, the Roman Empire at the turn of the 5th century, when two of the early church's most influential thinkers and writers were active. So on the left-hand side, I have a picture, you might recognize him, of the great Saint Augustine, canonized as a saint, church patriarch, who was writing at the end of the 300s, beginning of the 400s. And at that time was formulating what eventually became one of the most influential doctrines in church history, which was the doctrine of original sin. This is now accepted within the Catholic Church as orthodoxy, but it was a radical innovation in church theology at the time, and it didn't go without opposition. So one of Augustine's great intellectual opponents at that time was a British monk hailing from the opposite end of the Roman Empire, the monk Pelagius. And Pelagius really objected to this doctrine of original sin. It's somewhat difficult to reconstruct exactly what he thought because much of his views were, what we know about his views were left behind by writers who were quite critical of him. But Pelagius and his father Julian really objected to this idea of original sin proposed by Augustine. So what was this doctrine of original sin? Augustine wrote, "Even infants arrive polluted by sin. And since they've committed no actual sin, they haven't done anything yet, they're babies. Remission must be for the guilt attaching to a fault in their nature." So for Augustine, the idea is that there's sins, which are acts, things that you do wrong, but that there's an inherent state of sinfulness, and that is inherent state of sinfulness is literally and physically inherited across generations. So Jesus, he held, was without sin because he was conceived without sex. But the rest of us, because we were conceived through the sex act, that passed on, it physically transmitted this inherent fallibility that made us punishable. So Elaine Pagels, the Princeton historian of religion, summarized it this way, that for Augustine, natural evils and moral evils collapse into each other. Now, like I said, this was, an idea that's being developed 400 years after the birth of Christ, and it was not without controversy. So Pelagius, in opposition to this idea of original sin, really objected to the idea that anything hereditary, anything inherited, anything that was part of nature, could be considered sinful. So the theologian Paul Tillich, he summarized this in his A History of Christian Thought. Pelagius wanted to avoid the idea of hereditary sin. Sin is not a universally tragic necessity, but a matter of freedom. The contradiction of the moral demand must be an event of freedom and not a natural event. Paul Tillich was not an American, and I thought it was interesting that he even though Augustine officially won the argument within the Christian church, Tillich hypothesized that Americans still remain very Pelagian in many ways. Pelagius's most famous follower in the church was Julian of Eclanum, and he summarized Pelagius's views this way: whatever is natural is shown not to be voluntary. These two, by definition, are opposites, like necessity and will. Okay, so that's a little crash course in one of the most famous debates in early Christian history, Augustine v. Pelagius. Augustine eventually canonized as a saint. Julian and Pelagius eventually classified Pelagianism as classified as a heresy. Now, you might be wondering, why am I talking to you about this early theological debate? I'm a psychology professor. How did I come to be interested in this early controversy? And the reason why is because these are ancient ideas, an ancient debate about what exactly is the relationship between what we inherit and how we behave. And I will go one step further. And for what are we to blame? So in Augustine's view, we all inherit an inherent fallibility that makes our behavior necessarily corrupted. But the fact that we couldn't help inherit that doesn't get us off the hook in any way. We're still punishable within, according to the doctrine of original sin. So that is a theological approach to that question. It is a religious approach to that question. But this question, what is the relationship between what we inherit and how we behave, is also a scientific question. And it's exactly the scientific question that my lab at the University of Texas is preoccupied with. So I was trained as a behavior geneticist. And what I study is, how do people's lives turn out differently? I'm particularly interested in childhood and adolescence. And what is it about what we inherit genetically? What is it about what we might inherit through our environments, socially and culturally? How do these combine to shape how we behave? So even though I'm not a religious studies scholar, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian by training, I'm actually interested in very much the same questions that preoccupied Augustine and Pelagius and have occupied so many thinkers for millennia. So my lab, when we think about how do you study what we inherit and how it affects how we behave, one of the workhorses for what we do is a method known as the genome-wide association study. So this is known as GWAS. I'm going to pause for a second, and I'm going to ask anyone who's joining on Zoom if you would go ahead and mute your mic. That would just make it easier for me. It's hard for me to concentrate when there's the background noise. There's a few unmuted. If you could just go ahead and mute yourself, that would be great. Okay, so a genome-wide association study, it's abbreviated GWAS, and what we're doing is we're amassing data on hundreds of thousands or even millions of people where we have measured their DNA sequence. So we have measured something about those string of DNA letters, GC, T, and A, that vary between people. And then we've also measured what we would call a phenotype. So something that we can objectively measure about a person. This might be their height. This might be their disease status. This might be a behavior that they engage in. And then what we're looking for are DNA sequence variants that are more common in people who show a particular phenotype compared to people who don't show that phenotype. So you can think of a simple case like height. We're looking across the genome and we're trying to see what DNA sequences are more common in people who are taller versus shorter. But we can also do this for a certain behavior. So we can say across people who are, for instance, addicted to alcohol and people who are not, or across people who have schizophrenia versus do not, which DNA sequences are more common when people who have that particular phenotype. So again, this is a modern scientific approach, but it is addressing a question that has preoccupied us for millennia. What is it that we inherit, and how does that affect our likelihood of behaving in ways, even ways that are considered morally blameworthy, like addiction, or I'll get into this a second, aggression or violence. So in GWAS, the results of GWAS are increasingly used in medicine in the form of what we call polygenic scores. So poly meaning many, genic score, it's a score, it's a number, it's a measured biomarker, it's a risk factor that aggregates information across the whole genome to estimate what is your risk of developing a particular disease based just on your DNA. And I can't see everyone in the audience, but just guessing by the age of some of the people I can see, it's possible that at some point in time your physician has recommended you to be genetically tested to see if that you are an elevated risk for early onset Alzheimer's disease or certain forms of coronary artery disease. So in this graph I'm showing you, it is showing the relationship between a polygenic score, which is again a estimate of your genetic variance aggregated into a single number, and the prevalence of coronary artery disease. And you can see that for people who are at the tails of that polygenic score distribution, who have a very high polygenic score, the prevalence of coronary artery disease goes up pretty significantly. And that's why physicians are interested in it. Is there a way to tell in advance who is going to be particularly at risk for developing this disease compared to other people? I think where things get to be a little bit more controversial, but also from my perspective as a psychologist, especially interesting, is that we've now developed these same polygenic scores that don't just predict medical diseases, but that also predict engagement in a variety of behaviors that are often considered matters of moral concern. So in this graph, I'm showing you data from a paper that my colleagues and I published about 5 years ago. And again, we're looking at the relationship between a polygenic score and your likelihood of showing something in the future. But in this case, the polygenic score are genes associated with being a risk taker, with having disinhibited behavior. And what you can see is that polygenic risk score predicts your likelihood of becoming an alcoholic, so developing a moderate alcohol use disorder, ever using illicit drugs, ever using opioids. We can also take the same polygenic score and predict your likelihood of ever being incarcerated, ever being arrested. I should say that all the people in this study are of European genetic ancestry and would be socially identified as white. So this is not getting at racialized differences in criminal justice system involvement, but within people who are broadly ethnically and racially similar, differences in their genes do predict their likelihood of engaging in some of these behaviors of developing alcohol use disorders. So that leaves us in some ways with a very similar sort of question that the early church fathers struggled with, which is, can you inherit something that predisposes you towards behavior that is often considered immoral, or is it often socially punished, often is considered an object of moral concern? And if so, what are the implications of that? If we can predict from your genes that you are likely to commit a crime, or that you are more likely to be fired from work, or you're, less likely to complete college, how do we make sense of those of that connection? So unfortunately, we're not without data on this, and we can look at both within the scientific literature and also within popular culture. How do people make sense of this when they learn that there's genes that you can inherit that increase your risk of behaving in ways that are ordinarily censored or punished? What do they do with that information? And what's interesting is that people's intuitions about how to use the science often fall into broadly Pelagian or broadly Augustinian interpretations. So I just told you this, but just a reminder, the Pelagian interpretation is that the contradiction of the moral demand must be an event of freedom and not a natural event. So really, Pelagius is proposing this binary. Either something's moral or like something's a matter of right and wrong, or it's something that's part of nature. But if it's part of nature, it can't be something that we are like considering a violation of the moral demand. And what we see in pop culture is a lot of broadly Pelagian interpretations of modern genetic research. So, interpretations that say that if something's in biological, then the behavior is not wrong. So, I'm just going to give you a few examples of these. I think we're actually living through one of these kind of intuition shifts right now, and that's around weight and appetite. So I'm quoting here from an article by Gia Tolentino. She's a staff writer for the New Yorker, and she wrote an article about Ozempic, which is a weight loss drug, a diabetes drug, a GLP-1 agonist. There's now Wegovy. There's a variety of these. And she writes, will the Ozempic era change how we think about being fat and being thin? A popular growing class of drugs for obesity and diabetes could, in an ideal world, help us see that metabolism and appetite are biological facts, not moral choices. So again, this very Pelagian either or, that if weight and appetite is something that is biological, that is genetic, that can be pushed on biologically, we shouldn't see it in moral terms as a failure of willpower, which is how Americans saw weight, particularly in previous decades. We've already lived through this type of Pelagian rebranding around sexual orientation. So this is, I'm quoting from an article by a gay writer in The Guardian, in which he writes, science is on the right track. We are born this way. And he's referencing this idea that sexual orientation is innate, it's biological. He's specifically citing twin studies showing that sexual orientation is to some extent heritable. And it's basically saying this is a good thing. The more that people think that sexual orientation is biological, the less likely they are to think of that as morally condemnatory in some way. And again, I agree with his conclusion. I don't think sexual orientation is a morally, a morally relevant difference between people. But I think it's interesting that he's appealing specifically to the biology to support his agreement. So we have these examples all through pop culture. If you just put into Google genes and blame in quotation marks, you will see any number of headlines in which a variety of behaviors that people might or might not feel guilty about, or might not blame another person for doing, are alleged to not be a matter of blame because they're biological. Addicted to Facebook, your genes may be to blame. Too many one night stands, blame your genes. Lazy, blame your genes. Overweight, can't stop at just one potato chip. So all of these are examples, again, of this kind of broadly Pelagian interpretation that if something's inherited, it can't be a matter of right or wrong. We also see this within the scientific community itself. I'm quoting here from one of the most often cited papers that's ever been published in science. This was by Alan Leshner in the year 2000. And the title of the paper was Addiction is a Brain Disease. And he was explicitly contrasting this idea that it's not that drug addiction is a matter of weak or bad character, not about being a bad person, but they're suffering from a chronic illness. And the evidence that someone doesn't have bad character is the fact that addiction has such a strong biological component. Okay, so those are just examples in pop culture and in science where people are interpreting new evidence about the role of biology in behavior in these kind of broadly Pelagian terms. But it's not the only story that gets told. And sometimes people's stories are, in fact, Augustinian instead. So again, this idea that even if you inherit it, and even obviously you didn't have any control over what you inherited, but the fact that you didn't have any control over inheriting this risk factor does not, in Augustine's view, mitigate your blameworthiness for behaving in that way. In his view, babies are no less worthy of going to hell for the fact that they didn't ask to be born and they didn't ask to inherit this original sin, which all humans are subject to. And so it's interesting to look out into both pop culture, into the law, into science, and see where do we see more of this Augustinian interpretation of the science. Okay. So one place we see this is in some Christian parenting advice books. So I'm quoting here from a book that was a bestseller in the United States. It's by a Christian writer, Ginger Plowman. It's Don't Make Me Count to Three. And in it, she's saying that punishment, and particularly corporal punishment, is necessary in children. And the reason why it's necessary is because they're born with original sin. So she writes, to blame sin on a child's heritage is to state the obvious. In one sense, all sin is hereditary. We inherited it from Adam. But rest assured, the biblical use of the rod helps to deal with any hereditary trait that needs correcting. Okay. So this idea is like, oh, my child might have inherited like a predisposition towards ADHD or something that makes him rowdy, but she's explicitly advocating that doesn't make his behavior any less correctable or any more in need of correction. And what's more, that correction needs to be this physical punishment is what she's advocating for. We can see this, that's a very domestic example, but we can see this all the way up through the criminal justice system. So this is a quote from Antonin Scalia in a Supreme Court case around a teenage perpetrator. And he basically says, I thought that modern penology had just abandoned that rehabilitation thing. And he cited that decision cited the reasoning from this book in the 1970s that articulated this idea that crime was part of human nature, and in particular, some people were going to be biologically disposed to crime. Another really interesting, I think, example of this is another Supreme Court case. This was the defendant here is a man by the name of Jeffrey Landrigan. Landrigan was adopted at birth. He never knew his biological parents growing up. His adoptive parents had no criminal history, no substance use problems, were middle class, basically had, by all accounts, a normal childhood. But he began shoplifting and aggressing against animals around the age of 11. By the time he was a teenager, he was getting kicked out of school. He was still shoplifting. He was using drugs. As a young man, he committed a murder. He went to prison. He escaped from prison. He committed another murder, and he was in prison for the second murder when a fellow inmate of his said, "Oh, I recognize you. I was in jail with your dad." And Landrigan said, "Oh, well, I never knew my dad, so I can't tell whether you're right." And it turns out that the other inmate was correct. He had Matt Landrigan's biological father, and that father was also on death row in another state for also having committed murder. So Landrigan learns that not only has he been violent in ways that were kind of unexplainable from his childhood upbringing, that he also is the biological child of a murderer. And he, on the basis of that, interprets the fact that he or comes to the conclusion that perhaps he has inherited a biological liability towards aggression, towards violence. So he submitted a series of appeals, basically arguing that that should be a mitigating factor. Like in the same way that someone might, if they've committed a crime, tell the court about their child abuse history. I didn't choose to be abused, and this has increased my likelihood of committing a crime. He argued that his potential inherited liability towards violence should also potentially be mitigating. Like maybe it wasn't as much his fault if he got this thing. And basically, at every point in the court's reasoning, they said, no, we don't buy it. So this is a quote from the Ninth Circuit opinion. It eventually go all the way to the Supreme Court. It's highly doubtful that the sentencing court would have been moved by information that the defendant was a remorseless violent killer because he was genetically programmed to be violent, as shown by the fact that he comes from a violent family of violent people who are killers also. So here's this idea that, like, if you're genetically influenced, or even if you're genetically, in this case, genetically programmed, which is much stronger than anything the science says, it doesn't matter. That's not going to soften the kind of judgments of blame that we're going to make. And in fact, it might make it worse. Like we might judge that behavior or that person even more harshly. This is not just an opinion that you find among judges and juries. So I'm sorry to be looking around. I'm just like moving my little screen around because it keeps hopping around on me. Judges and juries. So this is the data, the really interesting data from social psychologists, which is getting at what are people's beliefs about genes and how are they related to their punishment judgments. So in this study, they asked people to imagine a variety of hypothetical sperm donors and then rate what is the likelihood that a child conceived from that sperm donor would show a variety of traits if the sperm donor also had that trait. So if the sperm donor is very tall, what's the likelihood that the child resulting from that donor would be tall? And what's interesting is that people's ratings for what is the likelihood of the child committing a violent crime, if the sperm donor also committed a violent crime, their estimates are not zero. So on average, this kind of representative sample of Americans thinks that some predisposition to violence could be physically inherited through sperm. They then asked participants to imagine a set of crimes and then recommend what they think the best prison sentence for that crime should be. So, should they get 5 years in prison, 25 years in prison, life in prison? And again, consistent with this kind of broadly Augustinian view of the relationship between inheritance and blame, people who thought that violence was more inheritable. So people who thought that if the sperm donor committed a crime, the child would be more likely to commit a crime. Those people actually had longer recommended prison sentences, of harsher recommended punishments. So we have this ancient debate in the early Christian church. We have a set of really modern scientific results about what's the relationship between genes and addiction, genes and weight, genes and sexual orientation, genes and violence. And what we can see is that it's rare that people make explicit reference to ancient Christian thinking when they're reasoning through, but many of our intuitions, both within science, the legal system, and in popular culture, do tend to be on this kind of broadly Pelagian versus Augustinian divide, with responses to more serious moral offenses, aggression, and violence being more likely to be met with this more Augustinian reasoning that even if you inherited it, you're still to blame for the behavior. Okay. And once again, I need to move my little Zoom thing around. All right. So the interpretations of the modern scientific research are echoing, usually unawares, these ancient theological debates. But I also think that, as a scientist, I find this very humbling because it points to the fact that science is not going to allow us to neatly categorize behaviors as either moral issues or not moral issues. We're embodied creatures. And nearly every human difference is linked to genetic differences between us, including things like aggression and violence. So the earliest Christians, even before Augustine and Pelagius, they also had a view on what do we need in response to sin. And so I've been really influenced in my own scientific work to think about, well, how would they have made sense of this before this kind of Augustine versus Pelagius argument became so embedded in our thinking, and what we learn from them? Okay. So with that in mind, I want to think about the kind of bind that this Augustine versus Pelagius sort of dichotomy or debate has put some of the scientific research. So on the one hand, if you think that something, if it's immoral, it can't be biological, then there's not really much sense in going and trying to understand the biology of a behavior you find immoral, like aggression and violence. Like, it doesn't make sense, even on its own terms, to do that line of research. Whereas I think if you are taking a more Augustinian view, that your biology can affect your moral behavior, but that just means that you're all the more blameworthy for it. That also doesn't really engender an attitude of how can I understand the biology enough to potentially change it and intervene in it. So what my group has been doing in the last 5 years is taking an approach that I hope to be neither strictly Augustinian or Pelagian, which is how can we better understand the biology of serious aggressive and antisocial behavior with the hopes of eventually changing it. Again, our primary workhorse in this is GWAS. We just put a preprint, if y'all, to the extent that y'all are reading the scientific literature, outside of your area of expertise, we have a preprint up on medRxiv, where we were looking at the genetics of 4 million people. And what we're trying to do is map where on the genome are there genetic variants that are associated with an increased likelihood of engaging in serious antisocial behavior. So this is just the human genome, the 22 autosomes ordered left to right. Every dot on this map represents a particular genetic variant, and the sort of peaks on this graph represent places on the genome that are more strongly associated with behaving in an antisocial way. What I find really exciting about this is that we're starting to get a better understanding of the genetics to start to be able to look at when are these genes active in human development and in which cells. So what we're finding is that the genes associated in these 4 million people with being more likely to be aggressive, more likely to be antisocial, those genes are most active in early fetal development, in the early mid prenatal area. So even though these are behaviors that are done by adults that we judge as immoral in adults, the genes that predispose someone to those behaviors are really doing something where they're shaping brain development in utero, and in particular in glutamatergic and GABAergic neurons that govern the brain's sort of balance of excitation and inhibition. Why that's particularly exciting is that points to potential ways in which we could intervene in this biology to help people who show persistent and serious antisocial behavior. So for instance, we did something called drug repurposing analyses, which was basically, can we identify pharmaceutical drugs that modify these pathways that we're identifying as important for this antisocial behavior. And again, I don't think of this as either Pelagian or Augustinian, because it's not saying you have a biology and therefore you're to blame for it. And it's not saying you have a biology, so therefore this can't be moral. It's saying this is a biology. Can we understand it? Can we understand it enough to try to intervene, to try to heal it? Okay. So that was a lot of information, both about the religion and the science. I've left a lot of time for questions, hopefully, and we can take that in any direction you want. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there and open it up for Q&A. and sip my Diet Coke, which I shouldn't be drinking at 8 p.m., but, I got to stay awake for y'all.
All right. So, any questions? And Nels will walk it around.
Are you saying when we know enough, we could use CRISPR to modify people?
Only in the most rare of cases. So CRISPR is a gene editing technology. It's most useful when someone's behavior or disease is caused by a single gene mutation. There are cases of people who have extremely rare variants of large effect that do have a huge effect on their propensity for impulsive and aggressive behavior. I talk about in my book about a Dutch family in which half of the men have inherited an X-linked mutation on a gene that ordinarily codes for the MAOA enzyme, and all of the affected men had histories of very serious violence. So that is a use case in which, if you are a woman in that family and you have a 50-50 shot of passing on this mutation to a male child, some sort of genetic screening or eventually CRISPR might be a use case for that. Although I will say that use of CRISPR in humans, even for non-behavioral diseases, it's still controversial. It's still an emerging ethical area. That being said, those sorts of mutations, which are, again, single gene disorders with huge, highly penetrant effects, are extraordinarily rare. Everything that we're talking about is massively polygenic. So it's, small differences scattered throughout the genome, each one of which has a tiny effect, but their collective cumulative effect can be large. That's the sort of thing where CRISPR is not going to be effective because it's not a single gene disorder. What I am proposing is that we can use our knowledge of the genetic pathways that those many genes affect to better develop medications that might be effective against people whose primary problem is impulsive violence. So right now, let's say you have a kid and they're really depressed, if you take them to the psychiatrist, there's a variety of treatments that they could offer you, including antidepressants. Whereas if we look at what are the pharmaceutical treatments available for someone whose primary problem is impulsive aggression, there's almost nothing for that. And I think part of that is that just we haven't understood the biology that gives rise to these disorders of aggression well enough to intervene effectively.
Thank you. That talk is really interesting. Have you or any others in the field looked at the possible link between epigenetic modifications and behavioral changes? And if so, are we far enough along to, give 30% of behavioral might be due to epigenetic?
Yeah. So yes, so my lab does do some epigenetic research. We particularly look at DNA methylation, which is just one of many epigenetic mechanisms. I will say that epigenetics, despite the vast amount of popular interest in it, is behind genetics, just like the DNA sequence variation studies. It's clearly an important layer because it's both affected by the gene sequence and by environmental interventions. For some other diseases, non-behavioral things, people have started to do research on, well, we don't need to CRISPR them if we can change the patterns of gene expression around, for instance, a mutated gene. But for the sorts of phenotypes I study, that research is still very much in its infancy. And then connecting the two layers, we're even further behind in that. So it's obviously theoretically important, but in terms of practical knowledge, like, is there an epigenetic index that predicts behavior as well as just a purely genetic index? No, not yet, not yet.
I kept waiting for a mention of the social and the economic factors that
Yes.
massively determine behaviors, particularly negative social behaviors, and I didn't hear anything.
Yeah. Yes. So
So
it's
you're telling me
definitely
I don't have free will? That's not a laughing matter. You have medicalized behavior, but there is a vast majority of human behavior that is not medically determined. It is socially and economically determined.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have laughed. I'm laughing because it is such a big question, and you know, the question about free will, and it's not one that I can quickly understand. So, first of all, yes, you're absolutely right. For all of the behaviors that I'm talking about, from drug use, alcohol use, addiction, violence, impulsivity, you know, anything that's characterized by disinhibition and antagonism. Genetics is only part of the story. We know that on average, about half of the variation in liability to any one of these behaviors can be broadly linked back to genes that people inherit, but that's half. The other half of the picture is the environment, and that these two things go together. So for instance, if you inherit certain genetic liabilities and you experience abuse or trauma or maltreatment in your family, the relationship between the genetics and the behavior is amplified, is magnified. Okay, so yes, you're totally right about that. When we're looking empirically at how much can we predict someone's likelihood of developing one of these behaviors, and we compare the strength of the association that we see from a genetic index compared to some of the canonical risk factors, so lead exposure, childhood maltreatment, social victimization at school, low SES, parental hostility, we see that the magnitude of the correlation for these measured genes is about the same as what you get for any of the measured environments. So I'm absolutely not saying that environments aren't important, but genes are also very clearly part of the story. The other question is, like, I guess what you just said about medicalizing something. That's a phrase that can be interpreted in a lot of ways. We can think about medicalizing something as, is someone deserving of care? Is someone deserving of biomedical scientific attention? And that way I don't actually think that medicalizing something is necessarily bad. But I also don't think we necessarily have to think about this as like an either or. So my talk here is like focused on genetics because that's what I do, and that's what my most recent book is focused on, but that absolutely does not imply that environment is unimportant or not a big part of the story. I'm sometimes asked, like, given what I know, what would be the thing I would do if I were like policy czar for the day and I wanted to reduce crime in America? And the first thing that I would do would probably be like lead abatement, and the second thing that I would do would probably be better like prenatal and maternal care. And those are environmental interventions around environmental risk factors for violence. So again, I'm not claiming that genes are the whole story here.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I can't get rid of this theme of free will, but it's because I don't really have a choice about bringing that topic up. So I just wanted to hear, I realize it's a big topic and you didn't really want to open that box, but can you just comment a little bit about the Libet type experiments and Sapolsky's determined as a popularized approach to that, please?
Yeah. So I would say from one perspective, in the free will debates, whether or not something is influenced by genes is kind of irrelevant. Like, if you think that we live in a clockwork universe, if you think that everything is determined, the fact that behavior is determined by genes versus the environment, it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of, it's another causal factor within the web. So I think one perspective would be the Sapolsky ones, which is the predictability of behavior by genetics is an example of how scientists are getting closer to like working out this, you know, the determinism of human behavior. And then I think if you're a compatibilist, I would say like Daniel Dennett, the existence of genetic influences are no more a threat to kind of how they've defined free will than environmental influences are. I think that would be like the Dawkins position too. In my book, I talk about this. I mean, I do grapple with this in my book a little bit. For me, it's less of a question. I'm kind of less interested, honestly, in the question of free will, because often that's a philosophical question that cashes out in the same answer for everyone. We either all have free will, however you define that, or we all don't have free will, however we define that. And that doesn't really help us make the sort of social decisions that we have to make, which is for which behaviors by whom are we going to hold people responsible in which ways. So if you find out that someone, this is a real life example, stabbed his boss with a pitchfork and raped his sister, but did it because he inherited a rare MAOA variant that's highly penetrant such that all affected males in that family have impulsive aggression. Should he be punished within the legal system? Should that be exculpatory? How do we treat that person afterwards? I don't think that the free will question really helps us grapple with that particular case, because if it's just an example of how we don't all have free will, it doesn't cash out in helping us grapple with that like distinction between his behavior and someone else's behavior, if that makes sense. I hate to be that author that says you should read the book, but that I give my best, I give my most considered answer in text, and it's hard for me to do that on the fly in the Q&A.
You know, I realize, could I have her back on the screen there?
Oh, no, you're talking. Go ahead.
Oh,
The
when
screen
I
goes to
talk.
you when you talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could make it quick. Yeah, there we go. I will. You know, you are a sort of a not very aggressive author, to stay with the theme of the talk, because you don't have a copy of your book behind you.
That's true. I don't. Yeah, I find the self-promotion of it, the selling of it is kind of the worst part of it. I like the writing of it and the talking about it, but not the marketing. It's not my bag.
Well, I can imagine that, writing your book is a labor of love, and you have to, every word almost, you have to go back through and make sure it's exactly what you're saying. So I applaud you for, I think about what it would take from anyone to write a book and pass that on to you specifically. I just didn't hear something. You were talking about being a czar of policy, I believe, and prenatal care was the second, and the first was lead, L-E-A-D, like PB, the metal, was the first one?
Yeah, lead abatement, yes.
Yeah, and where does that come from? What do you...
I think there's really good evidence now from across economics and epidemiological studies that lead exposure, even lead exposures that people previously thought were not toxic, are actually damaging to brain development and are linked to higher rates of aggression and violence and crime. So, we can look at this across birth cohorts, we can look at this across natural experiments around de-leading of gasoline, or unfortunately in the opposite direction, like Flint, Michigan, having exposure to lead. So, I think, I just think the evidence is really convincing that lead exposure remains too high, particularly in a lot of marginalized communities, and would be one of the best long-term investments that we could make in the cognitive and behavioral health of children.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, and I really appreciate you taking your time to do this. And I think your work is important, and you're doing a good job.
Oh, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, when comparing personality traits between separated identical twins and multiple genetic correlations, there appears to be a higher correlation for the twin studies. Why do you think this is?
Oh, this is one of the hottest topics in genetics right now. So what you're bringing up is what's known as the missing heritability problem. So if you look at the similarity of identical twins, either reared apart or reared together, they are very similar, and much more similar than fraternal twins who share a rearing environment but don't share a genome. And on the basis of that, we've inferred the effects of genetics for decades. And then you start to measure the genome and try to piece together a model of which variants are associated with which behavior. And you can usually account for variation, but not nearly as much as the twin studies would imply. They're there. So there's some sort of our models lead us to expect to find something. It's mathematically should be there. And then when we go and try to measure it, we can't find it. I've been told from my physics colleagues that this is not an unknown situation in other branches of the sciences. So what is that? Is it because our math is wrong? Is it because the heritability is less? Or is it because our measurements are wrong and we're measuring the wrong thing, or our models of how to measure things go together are wrong? I think it's probably a little bit of both. My intuition, which has a big confidence interval around it, and I will say that I think the lesson of genetics in the last quarter century has been to expect surprises and to not expect that the genome is going to give up her secrets very easily. So I don't have high confidence for my predictions for the future. But, when you think about identical twins, they share everything. They share nearly 100% of their genome except for a few random mutations. And, the prenatal environment, the rearing environment. And to the extent that there's interactions between those things, there's epistasis between genes and genes, there's interactions between genes and environment, then that could create a lot of similarity. And then as soon as you move out to how are you and I genetically similar? But that's not within the context of everything else that twins share. So my hunch is that it has something to do with we are using a bunch of additive models for a fundamentally non-additive process. But I don't know. Some people think that that's wrong, and it's just that the twin models are incorrect. So yeah, we'll see.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. This is kind of an off-the-wall question, but
Okay.
I'm reminded of a movie like 20 years ago of a dystopian future about how this sort of research can be misused, where the police are arresting people before they commit their crime.
Yes.
I don't remember the name of the movie, but
Minority Report. It's based on the
Yes,
Philip K.
yes,
Dick
that's it.
novel. Yes.
So, yeah, so the more benign, use of this research is to, really help people that might be identified. Of course, you'd have to ask for the genetic research of yourself, I guess. Like if you're prone to get Parkinson's or prone to get Alzheimer's or something, it's all possibly written in the genes, but I don't know. So that's my only comment. But it's very good talk.
It's not an off-the-wall question at all, and in fact, I talk about the book. I talk about the movie Minority Report in my book a little bit. So a couple things in response to that. The first is that, the premise of Minority Report is that they have these precogs, and they predict who's going to commit crime, and then there's a pre-crime division that goes and arrests people, like, right in the nick of time before they kill someone. And the big conflict in the movie arises because sometimes the precogs don't agree, and they can't say with certainty whether what someone is going to do. And that's how DNA will always be, I think. I think no matter how much we solve the missing heritability problem, no matter how much we understand the genome, I don't think there's ever going to be a purely deterministic relationship between someone's genes and their behavior. And the reason why I think that is because we have research on genetically identical animals, and they don't behave in the exact same way. I talk in my book about this Texas couple who were very attached to their beloved bull. I don't know how you get attached to a cow, but they were in love with their Brahman bull named Chance. And he died, and they got researchers at Texas A&M to clone him, and they had a second bull named Second Chance, who was genetically identical to the first one. And they loved Chance because Chance was docile and tame and like a pet. And Second Chance gored his owners twice, put them in the hospital. And if that is not the most perfect example of the non-determinism of genes to behavior, I don't know what it is, because this is a level of control that, over bulls that we'll never have. And we see this across genetically identical animals. The other thing I want to say is this science fiction kind of dystopian scenario in which people are, we judge their future behavior and they're penalized for judgments of future dangerousness. This is not science fiction. This is how criminal justice systems work with parole, right? Measures of dangerousness are part of parole hearings. Recidivism judgments are part of sentencing decisions. And those decisions are made on all sorts of information that I think is maybe less scientifically valid than we would like. So I'm not suggesting that we use genes in that situation. I would object to the use of them in recidivism and dangerous judgments. But we don't live in a scenario in which people are never penalized for their judgments of future dangerousness. That's exactly how our criminal legal system works.
You mentioned something that got me thinking, the behavior studies of identical twins versus of fraternal twins as separating the environment from the genes. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so the basic premise of any, I will say, twin study or adoption study or pedigree study is how do you compare people who have the same social relationship but different genetic relationships? And then does their similarity in their outcome follow their social relationship or their biological relationship? So with adoptees, it's, are you more similar to your adoptive parent, with whom you have a social relationship, or your biological parent who gave you your DNA? In the case of twins, it's, do twins who are all born on the same birthday, they share the same parents, they share the same socioeconomic status, they go to the same schools, they live in the same neighborhood, they have broadly the same rearing environment, they both share the prenatal environment, but one of them, one type of them is genetically identical versus the other, they have genetic differences between them. Fraternal twins are about as genetically related as, or they are as genetically related as ordinarily siblings. Does their similarity in outcome follow their social relationship or their biological relationship? And there's across 50 years of twin studies, it's just very clear that identical twins, whether reared apart or reared together, are much more similar for almost anything you can measure than fraternal twins. And that includes the phenotypes that we're talking about. Sometimes people think, well, that's because the moms know they're identical twins and they treat them more similarly. There's been lots of different tests of that assumption, but I think one of the most telling data points against that idea is that moms are the worst judges of their children's zygosity because they're so familiar with their twins, they're much less likely to think their identical twins are identical. So in our lab, we ask the mom to say, are these identical or fraternal twins? We have undergraduates who've met them the first time, are these identical or fraternal? And then we take their DNA and we can tell for sure. And of all the raters, mothers are worse than undergraduates who've met twins on one lab visit at accurately identifying whether the twins are identical or fraternal. And that's because the moms are like, no, they're not identical. They're so different. They're so different from one another.
A question and an observation. The question, when I heard about your talk, I thought about the Jukes and Kallikaks.
Yeah.
And now that, I mean, you're familiar with that, I'm sure, yes. Right?
Yeah, I mean, so the Kallikak, I mean, that's one of the greatest works of pseudoscience ever done, right? This idea that it was kind of a fake pedigree done by an early 20th century eugenicist, and was this idea that, I guess it was like this story that, someone cheated on his wife with like a lusty barmaid, and like all of the illegitimate children were bad and all of the legitimate children were good. There's lots wrong with the Kallikak story in terms of its intention, in terms of the fact that it wasn't true, in terms of the eugenic identifications and allegiances of the author. But just scientifically, I think it's really important to remember that genes, each parent only transmits 50% of their genes, and they're recombined with your partner with every generation, and that's why your kids are not your clones, and that's why your children are different from each other. And there is no dynastic genetic perpetuation of criminality that can be preserved across multiple generations, because that's not what genes do, particularly polygenic situations, which is what I'm talking about. So a lot of times when people hear like genes are inherited, they think I'm talking about like an unbroken lineage of predispositions towards vice and criminality. I think that genes do influence your likelihood of behaving in ways that are punished, but also there's genetic variation within families too, and that's one of the many reasons why it's not dynastic in the way that the Kallikak kind of pseudoscience portrayed.
Okay, the other, the antipsychotics came out in the 60s, I think, and they've been improving throughout. My sister-in-law is schizophrenic, and it's amazing when she's on her meds. It's just like a miracle. She's just perfectly normal. Everything is fine. Everything is great. She goes off her meds and there's hell to pay, and she has to be reinstitutionalized and brought back onto the meds in a regular fashion. And now schizophrenia, that's got to be a genetic problem, right? I would assume that.
Yes. Schizophrenia is one of the most heritable mental disorders. People put the estimates at 80% of the risk for schizophrenia is genetic, and then there's environmental risk factors obviously too. And what you're talking about is psychiatric drugs can do wonders, but they're not a substitute for an ongoing care infrastructure. Like, you can't just say, this was the great mistake of, I think, Kennedy era deinstitutionalization. You can't just say, there's antipsychotics, so therefore we don't need psychiatric providers anymore, or psychologists, or places for people to go. Because schizophrenia is a chronic relapsing illness, and people don't want to take their meds all the time because they have side effects, or because they're stable long enough they don't think they need them anymore, or that's just an extremely, extremely familiar story. And which is why people need medication, and they need treaters, and they need, family members like it sounds like you are. They need social care as well as pharmacological care.
Yeah. The meds are just a miracle. That's
Yeah.
the only way I can describe it.
Yeah. Psychiatric drugs, they're not a panacea, but they can be life-giving for people.
Okay, I have another question. Let's see. This is dealing with, there's a book called The God Gene, How Faith is Hardwired into Your Genes. What are your thoughts on this?
So I haven't read that particular book, and I would say that there's almost never the gene. Like there's no the depression gene, there's no the schizophrenia gene. Most complex human behavior is influenced by many genes acting in concert with the environment. So I'm assuming that faith probably works the same way. We see, my dissertation was actually on genetics of religious belief, and you see that identical twins reared apart are more similar for their religiousness than fraternal twins are, and people resemble their biological parents more than their adoptive parents when they're adults in their level of religious belief. So the idea that the genes you inherit kind of broadly affect this aspect of your mind as much as it affects other aspects of your mind, I kind of buy that. I also think, we have religion, and to my knowledge, I don't think our closest primate relatives do. And those behavioral, cultural, social differences between us and our closest relatives, I think they have to be related to our genes somehow. So otherwise, how did our brains evolve that? But that might be a minority view or a controversial view.
A related question is, Homo sapiens demonstrate a substantially higher level of cooperation and altruism within our tribes compared to other animals. Do you think this characteristic is in our genes? If so, any thoughts on when and how it came to be?
I mean, there is some theory on this, and I'm blanking on. It's called the goodness paradox, I think is the name of the book, and it basically presents this kind of self-domestication hypothesis that that we humans have over time selected ourselves as mates, as caregivers, as fathers to our children to be a more cooperative species. Right now, my understanding is that most of that work is theoretical. I love comparative genomics as a field. Like, this is not my area of expertise, but people who are beginning to really parse out like which genes evolved at which point in the primate lineage to affect, say, cortical expansion or like our verbal abilities relative to other non-human primates. Like, I think that's fascinating, and I don't think there's any good reason, and in fact, to kind of exempt what we think of as moral behavior or cooperative behavior or even religious behavior from this suite of really part of the human-specific mind that we can think of from a kind of comparative genomics perspective.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess we better let you get back to your evening, and we really appreciate you presenting for us. So anyway, I guess we'll let you go, and thanks again for being a part of us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. These were great questions, and I really appreciate it. This was fun.
Well, good. Yeah, maybe we'll do it again sometime, and you can come and visit us.
Maybe in person. I hope so in person.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. All right, y'all have a good night. Bye.